106.5 FM and online. It's the After 5 Guest with Wynne Thomas.
And time now for After 5 Guest. I'm delighted to be joined by Leslie Ann Jones and her book, Who Killed John Lennon? Leslie, thanks for your company this afternoon.
Oh, how lovely of you to have me. Thank you.
This is not really a book about Mark Chapman, but about really Lennon's own self-destruction. Would you say that?
Yeah, very much so. It's a cryptic title, really. I obviously didn't want to write another book about what happened. We know what did. But I wanted to investigate, to go into the backstory of all the different John Lennons there were. Who was the original John Lennon? When did he die? And who killed him off? And how did he reinvent himself so many times? And, you know, which John are we thinking about? Which one are we looking for?
Well, the acid tongue was a result of his childhood split, living from pillar to post, really, wasn't it?
I'm sorry, say that again?
I said the acid tongue he possessed was the result of his childhood split and sort of living from pillar to post in a way.
He had a very dysfunctional, damaged childhood. His mother gave him away to her sister Mimi when he was very little. And John never got over that abandonment. His father had also pretty much abandoned him as well. The partnership had broken up, his parents split, and his dad went back off to sea. And thereafter, Mimi brought him up. She was a very cold, caustic kind of woman, very unaffectionate. John didn't get much love when he was a little boy. You know, he'd sometimes ask Mimi for a cuddle, and she'd say, oh, for goodness sake, you know, you have a mother, you don't need me for that kind of thing. But of course, he didn't have a mother, not really. And in his early teens, he went looking for Julia, his mom. He did begin to forge a good relationship with her. It was because of Julia that he really got into music in the first place. She was responsible for him learning his first chords on the banjo and then on the ukulele. And she had a gramophone, she had a record collection. And so John was exposed to 50s music from that point on. And then, of course, he always said, I lost my mother twice, because when he was 17, she was knocked down outside his house by an off-duty policeman driving a car, and she was killed right outside the house, pretty much. So John then after had to get up every day and draw the curtains on the place where his mother died. And that's a horribly damaging thing for anybody to go through, let alone a very sensitive 17-year-old boy.
So sometimes with his mother, Julia, and sometimes with Auntie Mimi, and then losing Uncle George didn't help as well, did it?
Well, no, because George was actually Mimi's husband we're talking here.
Yeah,
he was quite a nice, affectionate man. He was the one who introduced John to literature when he was little, so things like the Just Williams stories and Peter Pan, Enid Blyton, that kind of thing. He introduced John to newspapers and to crosswords and to sketching and cartoons, that kind of thing. And so all of those things helped John to develop his creativity and to come out of himself a little bit. The kind of cartoons that he was drawing while he was still a schoolboy and the captions he was writing to go with them were way ahead of his years. And all of that was festering inside him. You know, he was quite a bitter, sort of spiteful person, really from a very young age.
Yeah, he seemed to be a naughty boy seeking love all the time. Would that be right?
Yeah, something like that.
So were Paul and him really true mates?
Yes, they were. They met, I think Paul was about 15, John was 17. John already had a band. He had the Quarrymen, which is named after his school. And a mutual friend, Ivan Vaughan, brought Paul along to meet John on the day of the famous Liverpool Fair in Woolton. And they were introduced, and John realized, here's a boy who can tune a guitar, who can play songs faithfully, who can remember lyrics. And he's clearly a lot smarter and a lot sharper than I am. But he realized he was clever enough to know that I've got to let this boy into the band for the sake of the band, to raise our game. If I don't, then we stay just as good as we are. So he was resentful of Paul for his musical virtuosity, but also appreciative of Paul because he was so musical.
So the split then after the Beatles between the two of them must have hurt both of them?
Well, John decided to leave the Beatles first in September '69, but he didn't announce it. He just was coasting along because John wasn't one for formalities. Things were pretty bad between the four of them. There were a lot of legal issues going down. And eventually, in the spring of 1970, Paul came out with a press release and said he was quitting the Beatles, at which point John was furious because he said, well, I said it first. But Yoko Ono took a lot of the rap for breaking up the Beatles, so-called, which she didn't do. The Beatles were already broken. They were already maturing. They'd grown out of each other. They were no longer boys messing around in a band. And they'd done all they could do together creatively. They wanted to work with other musicians. That was the crux of it.
Mm-hmm. So, and that cut in humour, was that built into the scripts of the films? I remember the stuff in Hard Day's Night, which was quite cut in places. Was that kind of, that they took on his personality into the script?
It's a very Liverpool thing, that kind of humour. I spent quite a lot of time in Liverpool when I was researching this book, and there is that wry, sort of sardonic take on life, and I think that the accent helps a lot because it's a very twangy, nasal, quite infectious sort of accent. And those sort of lines, clever lines delivered in that kind of an accent, leave a lasting impression. It seems to me, as an outsider, that virtually everyone in Liverpool is funny. And that's just the way they talk to each other. So I think that was actually part of their inherent personalities. If you took all of the Beatles individually and collectively, they were all that sort of personality. They were all variations on the theme.
How did America take him? How did he go there when he first went with the Beatles? Did they like him?
They loved the Beatles, didn't they? We know that from the Ed Sullivan Show that they just went down an absolute storm. And I think we were in a pre-politically correct age in those days when you could get away with things that nowadays we would wince at, or we would even say, you're not allowed to say that, that's illegal. But we know that John would imitate crippled people, for example. He would walk along the street behind them, people with physical disabilities, and he would imitate their walks and so on, or he would mimic people's accents in quite a cruel way. And I think all of that was indicative of his own insecurity. And perhaps he felt at that stage, we didn't have the syndrome then because we have to come up with names for things before people have them, don't we?
Yeah.
But we nowadays would call it imposter syndrome. And I think that John was acutely aware that he might be found out at any minute, that he actually wasn't that good. Whereas Paul McCartney clearly was a seasoned musician. And of course those years in Hamburg, when they were doing their, what we'd say, 10,000 hours, 5 shows a day, and honing their act, mostly other people's songs, cover versions of, but they were writing songs together, and they were stronger together than they were individually, I feel.
Looking for a mother figure, then, is that what drew him to Yoko, do you think? That's always been said. Did you believe that?
Yes, I do. Even Cynthia, who was only a year older than John, compare the two of them at that stage when they were both students. And Cynthia seemed like a middle-aged woman compared. And he was clearly into mother replacement therapy. So once he got Cynthia, she was pregnant, they had to get married, as one did in those days. But then he was also a Beatle, and their fame was going global. So Cynthia had to be secreted away at home with the little boy, and John was out there on the world stage. He fell in love with another woman fairly quickly, who was Alma Cogan, a big 1950s pop star in the UK. And they had a full-blown affair. They were checking into hotels as Mr. and Mrs. Winston. And John was passionate about her. She was about 7 years older than John. And then she contracted ovarian cancer. She died at 36. John was inconsolable. And within a couple of weeks, he turned around and met Yoko Ono, who was also 7, 8 years older than John. So always it was replacing the lost mother all the time. But it never left his songwriting. He was always addressing that subject in his songs.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, I mean, even the humour was in the affair name, Mr. and Mrs. Winston. Even that was even a comical kind of line from John. Yeah,
well, that was his middle name, of course.
Yeah,
wasn't
of course.
it?
Yeah. But his first wife Cynthia suffered a lot. He treated her pretty roughly, didn't he? Towards the end of the marriage.
I think, look, they should never have got married, should they? Really? They were students when they met. Unfortunately, it's the way things were in those days. People did tend to get married if they felt pregnant. So John wasn't ready for it. He was living a double life. He was being torn torn away to be a superstar. And Brian Epstein had decreed that she should be kept secret, that it wasn't good for publicity if the fans knew that John was married. It meant that he was unavailable. So Cynthia did have the rough edge of the deal, really. You know, she was being denied, more or less, from the beginning. And he was very rarely there to help bring up their little boy Julian. And when he was there, he was either asleep or he was out drinking and partying.
Yeah. So there are two things there, really. Did drugs change him? Did Yoko change him? Not excluding, of course, the Lost Weekend as well. So where was the changes in Lennon, which I saw later on in his life? Do you think that...
Well, Yoko, right from the beginning, she refused to be treated the way John treated women, because he could be quite spiteful and even violent. Cynthia said that he did hit her and beat her up a couple of times. John wasn't respectful of women in those days, and there was quite a northern male thing going on there as well. You know, people did not treat women nicely back then. But Yoko said to him, look, we meet in the middle. We are equals. You don't treat me like that because you won't see me for dust. And he was so in love with her, so obsessed with her, that he did gradually change. And he never laid a finger on Yoko. And also there was a role reversal thing there a bit later on when they had finally, after several miscarriages, they managed to conceive a child together who was Sean, who was born 5 years before John died. And we hear about the house husband years. It wasn't quite like that. John didn't stay home baking bread and changing nappies for 5 years. But he did more of his share while Yoko was taking care of business. So she was investing their money, buying sort of herds of cattle and buying property and that kind of stuff to maximize their investments and their savings. And John wasn't interested in money anyway, as long as he didn't run out of it. And Yoko took care of all that. So I think they were, you know, fairly ahead of their time as a couple.
So, I mean, there was a working-class boy or middle-class boy, whatever you want to say about him, who suddenly became absolutely massive. We know how big the Beatles were worldwide. It's incredible to think that, isn't it? And then, towards the end of the Beatles, Lennon comes out with this remark, the Beatles are more popular than Jesus in America. And that absolutely blew it, didn't it? It was a terrible thing to say, but it kind of made him less popular than he was in America. Would you say that as well?
Well, the interesting thing was that he made that remark in an interview with Maureen Cleave in the Evening Standard, London newspaper. Mm-hmm. And within the context of the interview, you could absolutely see what he was saying. It was literally a statement of fact.
Yeah, it was.
More people are fans of the Beatles than are fans of Christianity in the world today. And that was a numerical fact. And it didn't cause any kind of furore when that piece was published in the Standard. But then it was picked up by a magazine in America, and it was blown out of context. The one single remark was taken as John is saying, we're bigger and better than the Beatles. And, you know, especially in Bible Belt America, which is very unforgiving, and encouraged by a lot of DJs at the time who were inviting former Beatles fans to bring their albums, their books, their merchandise to public bonfires and to destroy all of it. And the Beatles really did run for their lives at that stage. It was a very dangerous time for them. It's surprising in a way that nobody ever took a pot shot at them before.
Well, there we are. It's an absolutely fascinating book. It's one of those books, I mean, I love the Beatles, and I couldn't put this one down. It's really fantastic stuff, Leslie Ann. And,
that's incredibly kind of you. Thank you very much.
And, of course, the book is now available in paperback as well as being, of course, the original hardback as well, isn't it?
Yes, it is, yeah.
Great stuff. Well, thank you for being After Five guest today. Good luck with the book. I found it absolutely fascinating. I love the Beatles and have loved them since 1965. And I'll keep on reading stuff about them, but I loved your book as well.
That's so kind of you. Thank you very much indeed for having me.
That's absolutely brilliant. Thanks so much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.